Chapter 12, Magazine X. What then shall we do? Stick, so far as possible, to the empirical facts, always remembering that these are modifiable by anyone who chooses to modify the perceiving mechanism. Aldous Huxley, Eyeless in Gaza Encounter magazine, which ran from 1953 to 1990, held a central position in post-war intellectual history. It could be as lively and bitchy as a literary cocktail party. It was here Nancy Mitford published her famous article, The English Aristocracy, a bitingly witty analysis of British social mores, which introduced the distinction between you and non-you. It printed Isaiah Berlin's A Marvelous Decade, 4 memorable essays on Russian literature, Vladimir Nabokov on Pushkin, Irving Howe on Edith Wharton, David Marquand on the Liberal Revival, stories by Jorge Luis Borges, critical essays by Richard Ellman, Jayaprakash Narayan, W.H. Auden, Arnold Toynbee, Bertrand Russell, Herbert Reed, Hugh Trevor Roper, some of the best minds of those decades. It was read in England and America, Asia and Africa. Promiscuous in its attention to cultural subjects, it was strangely silent, or simply obscure, on many political issues. In all cases, it was resolutely ideological, an integer of anti-communist Cold War thinking. It never broke even, but ran at a substantial deficit, needing to double its circulation in order to get out of the red. It was intelligent, and it was profligately linked to the intelligence world. Michael Josselson referred to it as our greatest asset. Post-war austerity had claimed Cyril Connolly's horizon in 1950, followed shortly thereafter by John Lehman's Penguin New Writing. The London Magazine was teetering financially, and F.R. Leavis, despite a generous grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, was almost through with scrutiny. Only the New Statesman and Nation flourished, its weekly circulation of 85,000 showing an impressive resilience to attempts to undermine it. Josselson's secret subsidies to 20th Century were part of this campaign. As well as cash, the journal, together with the British Society for Cultural Freedom, had received explicit instructions to engage in a permanent polemic with the New Statesman and Nation. 1. The CIA, mindful of the lackluster British performance at the Berlin Conference of 1950, was eager to penetrate the fog of neutralism, which dimmed the judgment of so many British intellectuals, not least those close to the New Statesman. That Kingsley Martin's magazine had not embraced the idea of a socialist vision, fully divorced from Moscow, rankled deeply with American Cold Warriors. British intelligence, too, was interested in projecting a voice which could oppose the New Statesman's policy of ambivalence, its soft-headedness, and terrible simplifications. The Information Research Department's support of Tribune, whose material was excerpted and distributed internationally by Foreign Service officers, was a gesture in this direction. Malcolm Muggeridge and Woodrow Wyatt, both closely linked to IRD, met with Tribune editor Tosco Fievel in April 1950 to discuss the future of the magazine. But Muggeridge concluded, "They are obviously badly on the rocks, and I said that in the interests of the Cold War, they should be kept going as a counterblast to the New Statesman. Developed one of my favorite propositions, that the New Statesman's great success as propagandists had been to establish the proposition that to be intelligent is to be left, whereas almost the exact opposite is true." To IRD's support of Tribune was not enough to persuade Fievel of its long-term future, and by late 1951, he was talking of a new Anglo-American left-of-center publication. Writing to Irving Brown, Fievel said that plans for such a publication have advanced, and several people are anxious that I should make a start. I have discussed the idea directly or by letter with Dennis Healy, Maurice Edelman, Dick Crossman, Arthur Schlesinger, David Williams, and others. For obvious reasons, this is something quite outside Congress for cult. Freedom activities. 3. The obvious reason for keeping the magazine separate from the Congress was, as Fievel well knew, because the American government had agreed not to conduct propaganda activities in Britain. The CIA had virtually declared a moratorium on agency money being used in that particular country. There is a sort of gentleman's agreement on that matter. 4. But this was about to change. Independently of each other, British intelligence and the CIA had been batting around the idea of creating a new magazine which could address the perceived deficit in the bank of intellectual anti-communism in Britain. This duplication of effort came to light during a series of meetings held at Frank Wisner's initiative in London in early 1951. Accompanied by Washington-based MI6 CIA liaison Kim Philby, whose friends Burgess and McLean were just months away from their defection to the Soviet Union, Wisner had traveled to London to discuss with British intelligence matters of common interest. During a series of meetings attended by MI6 and members of the Foreign Office, according to Philby, Wisner expatiated on one of his favorite themes: the need for camouflaging the source of secret funds supplied to apparently respectable bodies in which we were interested. "It is essential," said Wisner in his usual informal style, "to secure the overt cooperation of people with conspicuous access to wealth in their own right." At this, Philby was amused to see a Foreign Office official scribbling a note which read, "People with conspicuous access to wealth in their own right, rich people." It was during the Wisner mission to London that the question of a high-level publication aimed at encouraging a leftist lexicon free of Kremlin grammar was first aired. The two services realized they had been pursuing the same idea. Wisner and his Secret Intelligence Service, counterparts, agreed this would be folly, and they settled on a joint operation. By late 1951, the joint proposal had been cleared at the highest levels, and it was now passed down the lines. Philby delegated to his assistant in Washington, John Bruce Lockhart, nephew of the great Robert Bruce Lockhart, an intelligence supremo of both wars, who in 1917 had been arrested by the Soviets as a spy and imprisoned in the Kremlin. As his uncle's star faded, Lockhart the Younger had himself forged ahead as a model intelligence officer. He had headed up the military branch of SES in Italy during the war, and was an expert on penetrating communist organizations in Europe. Lockhart was well respected in Washington, where he had forged a close relationship with Frank Wisner. When Wisner wanted to get his son, Frank Wisner Jr., into rugby college, Lockhart, who had been schooled there, was happy to arrange it. Wisner trusted Lockhart, but not Philby. Philby, in turn, was unable to repress his dislike of Wisner, whom he described witheringly as a youngish man for so responsible a job, balding and running self-importantly to fat. 6. John Bruce Lockhart also enjoyed a good relationship with Lawrence de Neufville, with whom he had liaised in Germany after the war. It was Lockhart who now set up a meeting for de Neufville and Josselson with IRD's Christopher Monty Woodhouse in London. Woodhouse was a man of profligate talent. He had been introduced to the writings of Euripides and Lucretius at the age of 11, and before the war had been tutored at New College, Oxford, by Richard Crossman and Isaiah Berlin, who deployed an intense, low-pitched buzz of monologue in tutorials, and was known as the only man in Oxford who could pronounce epistemological as one syllable. Taking a double first in 1939, Woodhouse was dreaming of an academic career lecturing on Plato and Aristotle when war broke out. His education thereafter was quite different. Barrack square, gun drill, parachuting, warfare, sabotage, intelligence, and eventually led him to fight an heroic guerrilla war in occupied Greece. 8. A dashing, daring spy of the old school, Woodhouse was a key player in preparations to overthrow Iran's premier, Mohammad Mossadegh, working alongside Kim Roosevelt in a coup engineered jointly by the CIA and SIS, which installed the ultra-right monarchy of the Shah. 9. On his return from Tehran, Woodhouse was assigned to deep cover work for the Information Research Department. He ran a separate office provided by SIS opposite St. James's Park tube station. This office was staffed by a handful of junior Foreign Office people who were nominally registered to IRD, but were in effect run as a semi-autonomous team by Woodhouse, reluctant to do business in his own club. The reform, Woodhouse agreed to meet at the Royal Automobile Club on Pall Mall, where de Neufville held an overseas membership. De Neufville and Josselson traveled to London from Paris for the meeting. It was here in the late spring of 1952 that British and American intelligence made one of the most significant interventions in the course of post-war intellectual history. Over lunch in the RAC's dining room, they outlined their plan for the launch and covert sponsorship of a new highbrow magazine. Woodhouse, who was authorized to clear the project, did so without hesitation. Working for various different geographical divisions of the Foreign Office, this project stood at the more mundane end of the spectrum for Woodhouse. But he was a keen advocate of psychological warfare, into which the proposal so neatly fell. The tone of the conversation at the rack left him in no doubt that this was to be a subtle contribution to the covert propaganda struggle. His only caveat was that the British should be allowed to keep a finger on the pulse. It was agreed that the Congress for Cultural Freedom, through a designated CIA case officer, would consult with Woodhouse on operational procedures relating to the magazine. In addition, SIS wished to maintain a financial interest in the project, a small contribution which would come from IRD's secret vote. Woodhouse suggested that this contribution be earmarked for the salaries of the British editor and his secretary. This would avoid the impropriety of the CIA remunerating British subjects. Further, he said that the Foreign Office's principal interest in such a project was to acquire a vehicle for communicating anti-communist ideas to intellectuals in Asia, India, and the Far East. To guarantee distribution of the magazine in these spheres of influence, the Foreign Office would buy up a specified number of copies to be shipped and distributed through the British Council. Beyond this, the financial liability for the magazine rested with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Josselson confirmed that funds were to be made available through the Farfield Foundation, although the magazine would be encouraged to function as a business to allay suspicion. Finally, Josselson told Woodhouse that 2 candidates had been shortlisted for the job of co-editing the magazine. Subject to security clearance by both services, it was agreed that these 2 candidates be approached by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. With the working structure in place, the meeting closed with an agreement that Josselson and de Neufville would advance the project and then meet again with Woodhouse. Woodhouse, meanwhile, started looking for suitable fronts, Wisner's rich people, through which to channel IRD money to the new magazine. The American candidate for the post of co-editor was Irving Kristol, the executive director of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. Born in 1920, the son of a New York clothing subcontractor, in 1936, he went to City College, where he befriended Irving Howe, Daniel Bell, and Melvin Lasky. There, he became involved with the Young People's Socialist League, an anti-communist leftist organization at the college, and the Trotskyites. Small in stature, Kristol compensated by developing the muscular political stance so typical of City College undergraduates, accompanied by a readiness to jump his opponents, which would acquire him a reputation as an intellectual bruiser. Graduating cum laude in 1940, he went to work as a freight handler in Chicago and helped edit the ex-Trotskyist magazine Enquiry until he was called up. Drafted as an infantryman in 1944, he saw combat in France and Germany and was discharged in 1946. He went to England and began working for Commentary, returning to New York in 1947 to become its managing editor. The British candidate was Stephen Spender. Born in 1909 to a famous liberal family, he had a protected childhood. My parents kept me from children who were rough, 10, and developed a languid, easygoing nature and an attraction to utopian ideas. At Oxford in the 1920s, he came under the lifelong influence of W.H. Auden and achieved fame soon after with his first book, poems which oozed the sexual and political mood of the interwar period. He was immediately identified with Auden, Cecil Day Lewis, and Louis MacNice as a poet of the 30s, the decade which brought politics into the deepest chambers of literature and saw Spender joining the Communist Party, though only for a few weeks. His was more that kind of English parlor Bolshevism than anything else, typical of Spender's butterfly politics. Later, he was to describe his changes of belief and commitment as a matter of my utter vulnerability and openness. 11, Anita Kermode inverted Henry James Sr.'s famous remark of Emerson that he was like a clue without a labyrinth to describe Spender as a labyrinth without a clue. 12, another Jamesian phrase suited Spender well. He was a man without a handle. Spender later surmised that the reason he had been chosen to co-edit the Congress's new magazine was a consequence of my essay in The God That Failed. More perhaps than his disavowal of communism, it was Spender's positive relationship with the U.S., which made him an ideal candidate. In 1948, Spender had written a paean to America, "We Can Win the Battle for the Mind of Europe," in which he claimed that where American policy finds dubious allies and half-hearted friends, American freedom of expression in its greatest achievements has an authenticity which can win the most vital European thought today. If America chose to do so, she could play an educational role in Europe today, which would bring thousands of students to understand the best in American civilization and the American conception of freedom. For what is realistic today is to expect nothing of propaganda and political bludgeoning, but to take part in showing Europeans the greatest contemporary achievements of American civilization, education, and culture. 13 Spender could barely contain his excitement, going on to state that a word from the mouth of an American or English man of letters is regarded as almost something miraculous by European students. The Marshall Plan, he wrote, was well and good, but it is necessary also to strengthen the old civilization of the West in Europe with the faith and the experience and the knowledge of the new Europe, which is America. 14. Such sentiments were echoed by many other Western intellectuals. Raymond Aron announced that he was entirely convinced that for an anti-Stalinist there is no escape from the acceptance of American leadership. 15. It could hardly be said, as it later was, that America's intervention in the culture camp had no native support when people like Spender and Aron identified the survival of Europe with the American savior. Spender had other attractive qualities for his prospective employers. As part of the Max Bonde, MacNice, Spender, Auden, Day-Lewis group, he provided an important link to London's literary aristocracy, which still clung to many of the snobbish excrescences of the Bloomsbury period, but whose members surrendered promptly to Spender's charm. Josselson had experienced at first hand the intransigence of the British element at the Congress's Berlin debut, and many American strategists were irked by the superior air affected by the British intelligentsia. There's some important background to all this, Stuart Hampshire explained. In 1949, I believe, the Ford Foundation came to London, and they held a big meeting in a hotel to which they summoned the leading intellectuals. At that time, they had capital reserves which were worth more than the whole of the Sterling area. So, the intellectuals come, and the Ford Foundation offers them the earth. But they say, "We're fine, thank you. We've got all souls, and that's enough for us." The British were underwhelmed. They did ask for a few things, but they were so small the Americans thought they were mad. And the context for this is that there was a very deep Freud-like anti-Americanism. A kind of Wycombish snobbery meets Chinese left-wingery, epitomized by people like Empson and Forster. I remember Forster staying with Lionel Trilling in New York once. Trilling, who'd written a book about Forster, and was a rather pathetic Anglophile who'd never been to England at that point, was very nervous. Forster told him he needed to buy a shirt for some occasion, and Trilling took him to Brooks Brothers. But when Forster got there, he took one look and said, "My God, I can't possibly buy anything here." That summed it up. 16 Spender, who had worked for the British Control Commission in occupied Germany after the war, was well attuned to the needs of government in the area of cultural politics. Since then, he had spent a good deal of time in America, where he found himself under the wing of John Crow Ransom, Allen Tate, and the conservative duo Ben Tate and Senator Edward Taft. Cultivating his British colleagues with equal charm, Spender was just the bridge the Americans needed to make an advance on their recalcitrant allies. But his most irresistible talent, claimed his wife Natasha, was for being easily conned. "Of course," she said, "Stephen had all the right credentials to be chosen as a front. He was one of the great recanters of communism, and he was eminently bamboozable because he was so innocent. His father was bamboozled by Lloyd George. They're a very trusting family. It never occurs to them to think that people are telling them lies." 17. The cost of this congenital naivete would later prove to be high. In February 1953, Spender, who was teaching in Cincinnati, received a letter from Josselson inviting him to come to Paris to discuss an English edition of Preuves. From Christall, Spender learned that during a quick trip to Paris, which I made a couple of weeks back, I spent a great deal of time discussing this matter with Mike Josselson, Francois Bondy, and Mel Lasky, Moreover, Josselson and myself went to London for a day to talk the matter over with Warburg, Muggeridge, and Fievel. 18. Shortly before this London meeting, de Neufville and Josselson had met again with Woodhouse. They agreed on an arrangement for a publishing deal whereby Frederick Warburg, the publisher of Orwell, would lend his company's name to the magazine. In a letter from Josselson to Warburg, he confirmed that the Congress assumed full responsibility for the prompt payment of all bills presented in connection with the production and distribution of Encounter, and full liability for libel. Josselson made it clear to Warburg that neither he nor his firm is to have any influence whatsoever over the editorial side of the magazine. 19. By the time of their second meeting, Woodhouse and de Neufville had struck up a firm rapport. De Neufville's credentials were no less impressive than Woodhouse's. Born in London, he had taken degrees at New College and Harvard before becoming a Reuters correspondent. We got on extremely well, saw very much eye to eye. Woodhouse remembered. I always got on extremely well with my American colleagues, provided they weren't lunatics, he added, in a tone which suggested many were. Whenever Larry came over to London, I met him, or if I went to Washington, I'd meet him there, with my man in Washington, Adam Watson. 20. The two were to meet regularly over the next couple of years, until de Neufville returned to America, and Woodhouse went on to become director of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. As this was the only area where their responsibilities overlapped, they discussed operations and methods for Encounter, and the British operation in general over drinks at the Ray-C. Operations and methods initially meant putting in place what Woodhouse described as a cash flow and a line of contact. Be careful of thinking there was a system for anything in those days. It was all improvised, de Neufville later explained 21. Brought in to help with the improvisation and to act as a go-between for MI6 and the Congress for Cultural Freedom was Malcolm Muggeridge. Muggeridge had made a long journey from those days as a boy when he had sung The Red Flag with his father from a Labor Party platform in Croydon. His book Winter in Moscow, 1933, which presented the shattering of his Russian utopia, was one of the first exposures of the Soviet myth written from the left, and had marked the beginning of his political transformation into an agent for MI6. A member of the Congress for Cultural Freedom's Steering Committee, he was firmly aligned with its anti-neutralist, pro-American stance, reasoning that if I accept, as millions of other Western Europeans do, that America is destined to be the mainstay of freedom in this mid-20th century world, it does not follow that American institutions are perfect, that Americans are invariably well-behaved, or that the American way of life is flawless. It only means that in one of the most terrible conflicts in human history, I have chosen my side, as all will have to choose sooner or later, and propose to stick by the side I have chosen through thick and thin, hoping to have sufficient courage not to lose heart, sufficient sense not to allow myself to be confused or deflected from this purpose, and sufficient faith in the civilization to which I belong, and in the religion on which that civilization is based, to follow Bunyan's advice and endure the hazards and humiliations of the way because of the worth of the destination. 22. Secrecy, wrote Muggeridge in The Infernal Grove, is as essential to intelligence as vestments and incense to a mass, or darkness to a spiritual seance, and must at all costs be maintained, quite irrespective of whether or not it serves any purpose. Ever excited by a bit of cloak and dagger intrigue, even if he doubted its necessity, Muggeridge was delighted to be involved with the Congress's new publishing venture. His first job was to secure the rich people who could pose as credible private backers of the magazine. At a meeting in a Fleet Street pub, Muggeridge was able to report to Woodhouse that his search for financial conduits had turned up two willing candidates. The first was émigré film director Alexander Korda. As a friend of Ian Fleming and a former employer of Robert Bruce Lockhart, who worked for him as an advisor on the international distribution of films, Korda enjoyed close links to British intelligence. Following the approach from Muggeridge, Korda agreed to allow IRD to use his bank account as a piggyback for subsidies to the new magazine. The other conduit brought in by Muggeridge was his old friend Lord Victor Rothschild. Rothschild was closely connected to the magazine until the mid-1960s, but always as a shadow, never in the open. There were still practical issues to be resolved, and Muggeridge and Warburg, now referred to by CIA case officers as the cousins, went to Paris at the end of February 1953 to thrash matters out. Jasper Ridley, then Secretary of the British Society for Cultural Freedom, was instructed to buy their tickets and pay for their hotels. On his return, Warburg asked Ridley to write him a check on the British Society's account for £100 for his expenses in Paris. Ridley, whose weekly salary was about £10, was amazed. I think that Warburg either pocketed the £100 or spent it in buying jewelry for his attractive wife Pamela de Bayou, 24, he later surmised. On the 5th of March, 1953, Michael Josselson wrote to Stephen Spender with an account of the meeting between Muggeridge, Warburg, Fievel, Nabokov, Bondi, and Josselson. We need a magazine with wider appeal than Horizon, more like Der Monat. You and Kristall would be an ideal team of editors. There should be an editorial board with perhaps Muggeridge and Hook, who will be spending a whole year in Europe from July 1953. Muggeridge and Warburg are willing to put all the funds, which Mr. Muggeridge has meanwhile been successful in raising for the British Society, into the magazine. 25, referring to this arrangement. Spender wrote to Kristall, "It looks as if we are both to be employed by the British Committee." 26, he was half right. Kristall, the American, would be paid with funds from the CIA's Farfield Foundation. Spender, with money from the British Treasury's secret vote. By March 1953, Kristall had moved to Paris and was busy collecting copy for the magazine. The Paris office, which envisioned a journal that would serve as the mouthpiece of the Congress, produced 4 drafts for a cover under Josselson's direction. Neither Kristall nor Spender, who was still in the States, could agree on a title. The working title, Outlook, was judged to be banal, so they racked their brains and thumbed the thesaurus and bandied about symposium, culture and politics, Congress, witness, vista, testimony, writing and freedom. Kristall wanted to avoid the words freedom and liberty because of an aroma of boredom. Messenger, across seas, east-west review, compass, connect, exchange, interchange, present, turning point, circumference. At one point, Kristall simply referred to it as Magazine X. 27, if perhaps this would have been the most appropriate title, in the light of the clandestine spirit behind it. The title Encounter first surfaced in a letter dated 27th of April 1953 from Kristall to Warburg, but Kristall said he was not enthusiastic about it. On the 30th of April 1953, Alexander Korda wrote his first check for £250. So presumably did Victor Rothschild, though no record exists to confirm when his donations started. Thus camouflaged, British intelligence passed funds to Encounter from its inception. The cash flow was boosted by the regular arrival of a brown envelope at Encounter's office. The courier was a member of Woodhouse's staff. So, too, was the magazine's office manager, and later managing editor, Margot Walmsley, who came straight from her job as a clerical officer with IRD and remained the Foreign Office's line of contact into Encounter for over 2 decades. Walmsley later remarked to a bemused Frank Kermode that if he wanted to know anything about Encounter, she could tell him everything. Dying in 1997, Walmsley never disclosed that she was a Foreign Office employee, the Cultural Cold War, 108. Later, the IRD paid the money into a private account at publishers Seeker and Warburg would then arrange for a check for the same amount to be made out to the British Society for Cultural Freedom, of which he was treasurer. The British Society, by now no more than a front for IRD's cash flow to Encounter, then made over the same amount to the magazine. In intelligence phraseology, this kind of funding mechanism was known as a triple pass. Thus, circuitously, Her Majesty's government paid Stephen Spender's salary. Woodhouse himself never spoke to Spender of this arrangement, though he had ample opportunity to do so. His children and my children were at the same kindergarten, and we used to meet each other there, Woodhouse recalled. I would have tended to assume that he did know, and therefore didn't particularly feel the need to talk to him about it. This was our sort of drill in that kind of world. 28 Spender was later adamant that he had never been told of these arrangements. By June 1953, Encounter magazine was up and running, operating out of the British Society for Cultural Freedom's office on 109B Oxford Street before moving in September to offices in the Haymarket. Printing bills and other expenses for its first 12 months were met by a grant of $40,000 from the Farfield Foundation, a figure Cristall and Spender were advised by Josselson to keep to yourselves. Cristall, who had been in London since May, was joined by his wife, the historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, and their young child William. Shortly afterwards, Spender arrived from Cincinnati. Both were listed as shareholders in Encounter Limited, which was registered in December 1953, with the majority shares held by Junkie Fleischman as president of the Farfield Foundation and Pierre Ballamy as treasurer of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. In a notable rewriting of history, both Spender and Cristall would later record their collaboration as some kind of honeymoon. In view of the fact that Stephen and I were two such very different people, I think we got along surprisingly well, 29 said Cristall. I worked very happily with Irving Cristall, 30 said Spender. They did consider each other friends, then as later. But their professional relationship was problematic from the start. Spender was willowy, emotional, wincingly non-confrontational, and as an editor sometimes didn't know his arse from his elbow. 31 Cristall, by contrast, was mulish and uncompromising, inured by years of Brooklyn arguments to sentimental or intellectually precious behavior. Small in stature, he shared with Lasky and Hook both this and a shortness of temper. It's crazy to think that Irving Cristall, a former Trotskyite from Brooklyn, could go over there and deal with all those British intellectuals and correct their prose, said one CIA agent, 32. But it wasn't just Spender and his British friends who needed to watch out for Cristall. Josselson discovered very early on the caliber of the man he had chosen. Irving had stand-up rows with the Paris office, said Natasha Spender, who recalled hearing from Stephen that Cristall was given to shouting down the telephone at Josselson that if he wanted a house magazine, he could go find himself another editor. 33. In July, Cristall sent Josselson the prospective table of contents for the first issue. Denis de Rougemont on India, a short meditation on death by Albert Camus, pages from the notebooks of Virginia Woolf, 2 Japanese short stories, a memoir of Ernst Toller by Christopher Isherwood, Leslie Fiedler on the Rosenbergs, Nicholas Nabokov on Soviet music, Osef Chapsky on André Malraux's Voices of Silence, Irving Cristall on the Congress's Science and Freedom Conference, Herbert Lethe on the recent revolts in East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and Edith Sitwell on Hollywood. Book reviews had been promised by Muggeridge, Spender, Hugh Seton Watson, J.K. Galbraith, and Nathan Glazer. Pieces by Koestler and Aaron were dropped from the first issue after Nabokov warned Cristall that they were too militantly anti-communist. Concerned that the lineup for the first issue was not political enough, Josselson wrote as much to Cristall. Cristall replied tartly, "I'm not sure about your cryptic remark about the political contents living up to expectations. The magazine, obviously, should be a cultural periodical, with politics taken, along with literature, art, philosophy, etc., as an intrinsic part of culture, as indeed it is. The ratio of specifically political to literary, etc. Articles will naturally vary from number to number. In the first number, politics is relatively subordinate, since we are aiming to capture the largest possible audience. I have a very clear idea of what the Congress wants and of how one should go about getting it, but I can't operate efficiently with the Paris office breathing down my neck, sending editorial directives, etc. 34. In another fiery letter, Cristall again remonstrated with Josselson, telling him, "We here in London are not inept morons, and I sincerely believe that we can better judge the situation than you can in Paris. You and your colleagues in Paris think the cover is lousy? Well, maybe you're right. Then again, maybe you're wrong. Magazine covers are not, after all, your specialty. I think the cover is good, though doubtless capable of improvement. Muggeridge thinks it's very good. You think the first issue is insufficiently political? But then you obviously haven't studied the table of contents carefully. You think the first issue is too literary? Well, you're wrong. Perhaps I'm deluding myself, but I really think that, in Encounter, the Congress has hold of something far more important than even you realize. You, apparently, would be satisfied if we could achieve the standing of preuve. My God, man, we're way past that. Again, unless I'm deluding myself. Potentially, we have it in us to become, in a few months, the English language cultural periodical, and not only in England but for Asia too. Give us a few months, and we'll be the idol of the intelligentsia East and West, a magazine in which an Asian or European and American writer would give his eye teeth to appear. I mean this seriously, and if I'm wrong, then you ought to get yourself another editor. But you've got to give us time and editorial freedom to achieve this. Your attitude to sales puzzles me. You say you're less interested in them than in the magazine's impact. But isn't one a measure of the other? 35, had Crystal known of the financial scaffolding by which Encounter was to be held up, he would have realized this last question was redundant. Clearly, Crystal was not going to play the role of megaphone soapboxer for Josselson. Spender invented the concept of crystal power to describe his colleague's adamantine pose. After one threat too many, Josselson would indeed find himself another editor. But for the time being, Encounter needed stability, and Josselson had no choice but to stick with Crystal. The Paris office had won the fight with Crystal to drop Koestler and Aaron, but in return they had to concede an article by Leslie Fiedler, which made them deeply uneasy. Crystal had originally invited his friend Fiedler to submit an article on Karl Marx, but Fiedler showed no enthusiasm and offered him instead a piece on the Rosenbergs. If Crystal wanted something provocative for the first issue, he had got it. On the morning of their execution, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg sat down in their cell at Sing Sing prison to write a letter to their two young children, Robert and Michael. Always remember that we were innocent and could not wrong our conscience, the letter ended. Just after 8 o'clock on the evening of 19th of June 1953, minutes before sundown announced the start of the Jewish Sabbath, and on the eve of their 14th wedding anniversary, the Rosenbergs were put to death in the electric chair. First Julius, then Ethel. Before being strapped into the chair, Ethel turned to the prison matron, reached out her hand, and drew her close to kiss her on the cheek. The Rosenbergs had been convicted in March 1951 of transmitting American atomic secrets to the Soviets. After retreating to a synagogue to contemplate his sentence, Judge Kaufman returned to the court to condemn the Rosenbergs to death for their part in what he described as a diabolical conspiracy to destroy a God-fearing nation. 36. Never before in America had capital punishment been imposed on anyone convicted in peacetime of espionage. The international outcry which followed presented America's propagandists with their most urgent challenge since the opening sallies of the Cold War. The question of the Rosenbergs' guilt, and there could be little real doubt that they were guilty, was not the central issue. To most observers, the case against them was incontrovertible. But it fell to American strategists to convince the world not simply that the verdict was incontestable, but that the punishment fitted the crime. When two innocents are sentenced to death, it is the whole world's business, Jean-Paul Sartre exclaimed, defining fascism not by the number of its victims, but by the way it kills them. He added that the execution was a legal lynching that has covered a whole nation in blood. 37. To make sure the whole world knew it was its business, the communists orchestrated a massive campaign for clemency, organizing coverage in the communist-controlled press, and arranging for Communist Front organizations to petition American embassies. London received thousands of petitions and protests bearing several thousand signatures. Paris reported that it was receiving telegrams, letters, and petitions at the rate of approximately 50 per day. In France especially, the Rosenberg case became the symbolic rallying point for anyone who had a bone to pick with the American government. Protests were staged all over France, and many of them turned into anti-American riots. One man was killed in a Libérez les Rosenbergs rally in the Place de la Concorde. 38, Melvin Lasky, although queasy about the use of capital punishment during peacetime, ridiculed these protests as the product of fashionable anti-American resentments. Certainly, none of the communist-backed lobbies formed to defend the Rosenbergs publicized the fact that on the same day that the Rosenberg Defense Committee was founded in France, 11 former leaders of the Czech Communist Party were executed in Prague. Nor did they discuss the fact that more communists had been shot by Stalin than in any fascist country, or that in the Soviet Union, workers were sent to hard labor camps if they were more than 5 minutes late for work on 2 occasions, nor that when artists were told to enter a competition for a statue to celebrate Pushkin's centenary, the first prize went to a sculptor whose statue showed Stalin reading Pushkin's work. Yet Melvin Lasky's analysis remains fantastically simplistic. The U.S. ambassador in Paris, Douglas Dillon, had pointedly cautioned the Secretary of State in a cable dated 15th of May 1953 that the majority of people in France were overwhelmingly of the opinion that the death sentence is unjustifiable, and warned that people who urge clemency should not all be taken as unconscious dupes of the communists. Fortunately, the clemency drive could not be passed off solely as a communist conspiracy. One American intelligence report stated that in Western Europe, pleas for clemency have very recently emerged in the socialist and independent press and from official socialist groups, and in England, some labor opinion supports clemency. Such non-communist pleas for clemency are based on certain doubts about the guilt of the Rosenbergs, and on the ground that clemency will play less into the hands of communist propagandists than will execution and consequent martyrdom. 41. The whole American psychological warfare apparatus now faced a massive challenge. For the next 6 months, right up to the Rosenbergs' execution in June, it pulled together all its resources to convince the non-communist world that American justice was just. The Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, was ordered to coordinate the campaign, whose central objective was to place the Rosenbergs in the context of a negative communist archetype, the communist as monster, which needed bloody sacrifices. It compiled reports for briefing the president and all his men based on embassy dispatches and CIA reports, and issued a volley of instructions to all American posts abroad. But whilst PSB generated reports which showed the Rosenbergs were fairly convicted and guilty as charged were well amplified in the European press, many U.S. diplomatic representatives continued to press for clemency. In France, Ambassador Dillon remained deeply concerned with the adverse effect in Western Europe of the execution and pressed for the sentence to be reappraised in terms of the higher national interest. 42. As PSB examined the entire scope of the Rosenbergs' execution, particularly the impact of such a decision on foreign psychology and its effect on U.S. prestige and U.S. leadership, 43. C.D. Jackson was taking a slightly different tack. Though he was confident that the Rosenbergs deserved to fry 100 times for what they have done to this country, he was bent on extracting a confession of guilt from them. This, of course, would have changed the whole complexion of the case. In a hand-delivered letter to the Attorney General, Herbert Brownell, dated 23rd of February 1953, C.D. wrote, "It is worth one more try to crack at least one of the Rosenbergs. Cracking the Rosenbergs," he went on, "is not a third-degree problem, but a psychiatric problem. Therefore, would it not be possible to get some really skillful Jewish psychiatrist, say Dr. Carl Binger, to attempt to insinuate himself into their confidence during these next 30 days? And if they did show signs of coming along, a stay of execution for another 30 or 60 days could be arranged while the work progressed." 44. In May, C.D. came up with another idea. In a memo for the file, on White House notepaper, C.D. wrote, "Spoke to Brownell and urged him to play war of nerves with Rosenbergs, including, if necessary, temporary stay of execution by the president. Brownell advised that the matron had managed to ingratiate herself and that they had hopes in that direction. Urged upon Brownell that the warden, matron, prison doctor, and anybody else involved should have impressed upon them the subtleties of the situation and the game that was being played, rather than let them play it by ear. This was no longer a police matter. Brownell agreed to do something along these lines." 45. Just how far the matron was able to ingratiate herself remains a matter of speculation. From Ethel's last gesture, however, one can deduce that she came pretty close. Meeting in cabinet on the 19th of June 1953, the date set for the execution, a nervous Eisenhower admitted he was struck by the element in his mail reflecting honest doubt about the Rosenberg judgment, and said it seemed strange our judicial system should be attacked in so clear-cut a case. 46, Herbert Brownell assured Eisenhower there was no question of doubt here, merely a technicality. "The public doesn't know of technicalities," snapped Eisenhower. To which Brownell answered, "Who's going to decide, pressure groups or the judicial system? The communist objective is to show that Dwight Eisenhower can be pressured." 47. Again, Eisenhower showed his impatience, telling Brownell he was concerned only with honest citizens. C.D. Jackson now cut in and acknowledged that some people were finding the death sentence hard to understand in light of the fact it had not been passed down on other convicted spies like Klaus Fuchs. To which C.D., as friend Henry Cabot Lodge, recently appointed Eisenhower's tactical expert on communism, replied confidently, "All can be easily explained." "Not easily to me," snorted Eisenhower, 48. As all hope of clemency began to recede, even Michael Josselson had been moved to call for mercy. Michael thought they were guilty, but that they shouldn't be executed because it was such bad PR. He sent a personal telegram to Eisenhower asking for clemency, 49, Diana recalled. Additionally, Josselson organized for Denise de Rougemont to cable an appeal to the White House on 13th of June, 1953. The Writers, Scientists, and Artists Association with the International Congress for Cultural Freedom appeal to you for clemency for the Rosenbergs, read the Western Union telegram. "We believe that such an action on your part would be in the humane tradition of Western democracy and would serve the cause of freedom throughout the world." 50. Even Pope Pius XII intervened, asking Eisenhower to temper justice with charity, but to no avail. "We were devastated at the execution. It was so stupid," said Diana Josselson, Pot 51. In late July, Irving Kristol received Leslie Fiedler's piece titled A Postscript to the Rosenberg Case. Fiedler, a former member of the Young Communist League and the Socialist Workers' Party, had drifted away from the left by the early 1940s and was now writing virulent anti-communist essays, so full of dubious psychologizing and calls for atonement by the entire left that Harold Rosenberg felt compelled to publish a lengthy rebuttal called Couch, Liberalism, and the Guilty Past. It was in this mood that Fiedler had penned his thoughts on the Rosenberg case. Fiedler noted that, at first, not even the communists were interested in identifying themselves with the couple, as they were so central to their whole espionage effort and so flagrantly guilty. He made a distinction between the factual Rosenberg case and a second, legendary Rosenberg case, in which, thanks to a carefully orchestrated fellow traveling mythology, they had been built up as martyrs in the tradition of Dreyfus. And thus, as the flags of the gallant old causes were unfurled, liberal-minded people everywhere had been the victims of a kind of moral blackmail. 53. He went on to blame the communists for the Rosenbergs' suffering and death, alleging that it was willed by the makers of communist opinion and relished by them, as every instance of discrimination against a Negro in America is willed and relished as further evidence that they are right. He had been there, said Fiedler, right in the thick of a Europe reveling in its anti-Americanism. He had seen the faces of the communist crowds surging and screaming before the American embassy in Rome, and he had seen nothing but joy. "Death to the killers of the Rosenbergs," the crowd had chanted, before going off to sit afterwards over a bottle of wine, content with a good day's work. As for the Rosenbergs, well, they were unattractive and vindictive, but human, taking an interest in their children, concerned with operations for tonsillitis and family wrangles. But Fiedler was so repulsed by the couple that he had difficulty fitting the Rosenbergs to a human story. So he went on to claim that they had, in fact, dehumanized themselves by becoming official cliches, even up to the moment of their death. "It is a parody of martyrdom they give us, too absurd to be truly tragic," he wrote. Commenting on the letters the couple wrote to each other from their separate cells in Sing Sing prison, Fiedler seemed affronted as much by Ethel Rosenberg's literary style, or lack of, as by Julius's failure to be sufficiently intimate with his wife and accomplice. "We have grown used to communist spies lying in court with all the conviction and fervor of true victims." There was the resample of Alger Hiss, to name only one, 54, "But we had always hoped that to their wives at least, in darkness and whispers, they spoke the truth. But they couldn't speak in anything other than code, even to each other. And so, Fiedler asked, as they were not martyrs or heroes, or even human beings, what was there left to die? 55 Sidney Hook, when he saw proofs of the article, was alarmed. James T. Farrell had once said of Hook that he submits the living complex reality of history to a logic machine and chops it up. The way in which he practices selective emphasis amounts to legerdemain. All kinds of problems and contradictions are going to get in his hair and he'll have to wash them out. 56, Hook could quickly identify these defects in others, if not in himself, and he was sure that Fiedler's analysis was going to stick in the Congress's hair. Writing to Kristall, who had sent him the proofs, he counseled that the piece be run with the following apologia. These remarks should not be construed as an attack against human beings who are dead, for we must respect the dead as human beings. But the point is that in their political life, the Rosenbergs abandoned their role as human beings and put themselves forward as political symbols. We are therefore making an analysis not of human personalities, but of a political myth. 57, a less succinct version of Hook's suggested edition, did find its way into Fiedler's text, but its impact was lost in an article which remained striking for its human meanness. News of the Fiedler piece spread fast, and within a week, the entire print run of 10,000 copies of Encounter's first issue sold out. How many of these were advance purchases by the Foreign Office is not known. According to Tom Braden, the CIA also paid circulation funds to get it accepted. Given the dearth of high-level journals in England, there was never any chance that Encounter's debut would be met with indifference. Now its name was on everybody's lips, and no dinner party passed without a heated discussion of its contents. Within days, the fallout began to reach the Encounter office in the form of a bulging mailbag. From Christopher Isherwood came praise for an exciting and unstuffy debut. Leonard Woolf wrote that he found every article above the average and described the Fiedler piece as exceptionally good. From a distance, Melvin Lasky deduced that the Fiedler piece would guarantee a bitter struggle for Encounter. Signs that this was the case appeared in a trio of letters received by Spender on the morning of 22nd of October 1953. Writing to Josselson, Spender quoted from E.M. Forster's letter, which expressed particular resentment at the Rosenberg article, not for its factual findings, which may be correct, but for the contempt and severity with which it treats Ethel Rosenberg's last days. Most offensive was the compassionate ending with its mysterious assertion that here was a human being who had acted in a non-human fashion and who would be pardoned by the human being who had written the article. I wonder how he will act if he is ever condemned to death? 58. Czeslaw Milosz didn't like the Rosenberg piece either, Spender told Josselson. Worse still, T.S. Eliot, writing in answer to Spender's request for an article, said he had doubts about the effectiveness of Encounter, as it was so obviously published under American auspices. If he wanted to say something to influence American opinion, wouldn't he be better off saying it in a paper published in America for American consumption? The point is that Eliot here states the kind of reputation we have to try and live down of being a magazine disguising American propaganda under a veneer of British culture. 59, Spender explained. Agreeing with Hugh Gaitskell's comment that any politics we published would be suspect through people knowing that we had American support, Spender concluded that any direct anti-communist sentiments simply defeat their own ends. He went on to tell Josselson that he found the letters deeply disturbing, adding that, as far as my own personal position is concerned, the implied criticism that I am putting in articles which serve American purposes is naturally very painful to me. 60. There was a puerile anti-Americanism in England at that time, said Natasha Spender. Eminent, respectable people were full of reactionary cliches about America being an adolescent country and all that. And Stephen was constantly being criticized by these people who said they wouldn't even have a copy of Encounter in their house because it was so obviously American. And this made him very angry because he wanted to defend those colleagues whom he admired from his time in America. 61 Fiedler, apparently, was one defense too far for Spender. Monty Woodhouse remembered being staggered when Spender more or less exploded and said he wasn't going to take part in a propaganda exercise anymore. I assumed he shared my views and the views of all of us on the desirability of intellectual reaction to the communists. I thought it was intellectually too simple for him to say he was being frustrated in some way. 62. Spender did acknowledge that the Rosenberg article had not offended everyone, and he defended it as not at all propaganda. But he was deeply worried that it was broadly regarded as being the kind of Trojan horse contained within Encounter. 63. This, and more, was implied in Anthony Hartley's review in The Spectator, which claimed to have detected something of the pomposity of official culture in the magazine's first issue, and remarked, "It would be a pity if Encounter, in its turn, were to become a mere weapon in the Cold War." 64. The Cambridge Don and critic Graham Hoe referred to Encounter as that strange Anglo-American nursling and claimed it was not as free as it declared. "It's not free from obsession or idées fixes," he said, adding that it had a very odd concept of culture indeed. In a sideswipe at Encounter's sponsors, he remarked that he did not like to contemplate the concept of cultural freedom that could make it possible to write or to print the Fiedler piece. 65. More mischievous was an item in the Sunday Times Atticus column, which referred to the magazine as the Police Review of American-Occupied Countries. A.J.P. Taylor, writing in The Listener, simply ignored the fuss about the Rosenberg piece to complain, "There is no article in the present number which will provoke any reader to burn it or even to throw it indignantly into the wastepaper basket. None of the articles is politically subversive. All are safe reading for children. Most of them are written by the elderly and the established." 66. "Have you seen Encounter?" Mary McCarthy asked Hannah Arendt. "It is surely the most vapid thing yet, like a college magazine got out by long dead and putrefying undergraduates." 67. Privately, Spender told friends that he had always been against printing the Fiedler piece, but had felt he could not oppose Christall on everything in the first issue, and appreciated Christall's need to make his mark in his new milieu. But he also confided that the Fiedler piece was as good a way as any of letting British readers know just how awful a certain type of American intellectual could be. 68. This echoed the view of Harold Rosenberg, who, despairing at Fiedler's lack of depth, wrote that the article had achieved nothing beyond confirming the widely held belief that everyone in America lives on a billboard. Just as Fiedler's piece divided Encounter's readers, so it drove a wedge between its co-editors and broadened the gap between them. By March 1954, Spender was writing to Josselson to complain that Christall never agreed to any of his suggestions, and that unless Christall would admit his own ignorance in certain matters, Encounter risked losing the position it had attained. He further accused Christall of running the magazine as if he, Spender, were not there. Indeed, for much of that year he wasn't, as he had been, according to Natasha Spender, coerced by Josselson and Nabokov into undertaking a foreign tour on behalf of the Congress. "I am writing to you now because I have complained dozens of times verbally to you without it having the slightest effect," Spender admonished Christall. "I must be certain that plans for improving the magazine are not simply blocked by your unwillingness to consult me or anyone else." 69. Josselson took up Spender's corner, writing frequently to chastise Christall for ignoring advice, and warning him to improve the look of the magazine and to offer the readers something worthwhile instead of the crap we have been offering them so far and which can only have hurt the magazine. 70. Within 2 years of Encounter's launch, the Spender-Christall relationship had frayed beyond repair. "I find it impossible to work with Irving because there is no basis and no machinery for cooperating," Spender told Josselson. "I therefore think it would be quite dishonest to go on working with him." 71. Whilst Josselson battled to resolve the situation, another, more serious problem arose.